We know of any things. Please be patient while we allow our attendees to enter the call and get our live stream on Facebook started. We will open and start in about 2 minutes. We see that people are just signing in, so please note that there will be a recording of this event and we will be available on our social media pages from Facebook to YouTube and all kinds of shares in between. We have some questions planned, but if you have a question for our guests, please do type them into the Q&A box. We'll address them as time permits. Thank you for joining. I dropped the link to the Women's Caucus in the chat box. If you are not yet a member, please do join. Also check out for future events. This is Women's History Month. We're so happy that you could be here today to kick things off. And if you haven't done so already, please tell us where you're calling in from and where you vote in the chat box.
Are we ready to go, Elizabeth?
I think we can get started, absolutely. So I'm going to take us live on Facebook. Okay, just one moment, please. And we'll just give it another minute as everybody logs in. I see that there are a few people still at the waiting room and I just received an email. So let's give it a minute or two and we'll be right with you. Welcome, everyone.
Let's see if anybody said where they are. I'm going to say where I'm from. You're in Germany, Anne, right? So one Anne in Germany and one Anne in Denver. Are you right there in Denver? It
Sure
must be
am.
cold.
Yeah, it's
Is
a
it
chilly
freezing?
morning here.
Oh.
It's fun to see where everybody's calling in from. Go ahead, don't be shy.
Is it the problem with Facebook or with Elizabeth? Is it a problem with Facebook or with whatchamacallit, Zoom?
Bear with us 1 or 2 more moments, everyone. Having a lot of late logins. Will be started in 1 minute. All right. Barcelona, wonderful. I speak to a few other members from Barcelona every day for our Wisconsin team. Annie Grawl is our head. Please tell every voter you know to vote for Wisconsin right now. Looks like we've got some people in England and Greece. Thank you for attending. And we're going to go live and get started right now. Thanks very
Okay.
much, everyone, and welcome.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and welcome to all of you who have logged on. I'm Anne Hessen, and it's my privilege to lead the Democrats Abroad Global Women's Caucus. Thanks for joining us as we kick off Women's History Month and mark International Women's Day with Anne DePrince, noted author and expert on violence against women. International Women's Day, marked annually on March 8th, is a time for celebrating women's achievements, for educating and raising awareness of women's equality, and lobbying for the many, many issues of concern for women. Well, the DA Global Women's Caucus is the largest of Democrats Abroad constituency groups and has grown into a dynamic group of activists laser focused on exactly these issues. But there's so many issues, from assault on reproductive rights to the lack of equality to the skyrocketing incidences of intimate partner violence. Indeed, every issue is a woman's issue. So in order to move forward efficiently on all of these agendas at the same time, the GWC has formed several issue action teams, each led by an expert in her field. Our teams do research, educate and inform our members, track legislation, develop activist toolkits, and create online events and more. Today's event has been organized by Marnie Delaney, who expertly leads our Violence Against Women Action Team. She'll fill us in on the details about the issues and her work, and introduce our special guest and moderate the discussion. I'm very grateful for Marnie for leading this important team, and pleased to introduce her now. Marnie?
Thanks so much, Anne. That's so nice. We are here today because recently hundreds of young girls have reportedly been poisoned with toxic gas in 58 schools in a country I won't name, just because they're little girls who were in school. We're here today because femicide is actually a word, meaning the killing of a woman or girl, usually by a man, because of her gender. Most of you may immediately think of so-called honor killings in distant lands, but femicide is everywhere. 4 girls murdered and raped in a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. 14 women massacred and more injured in an anti-feminist outburst. Women targeted in churches and nail salons. And perhaps you remember the 10 girls killed in a one-room Amish schoolhouse where the shooter ordered the boys to help him bring in supplies, including candles, toilet paper, and additional guns and ammunition. In the United States, almost 3 women a day are murdered by an intimate partner. We're here too because of harassment, rape, stalking, and the grooming of young girls, because of female genital mutilation, forced pregnancies, child marriages, and all the other ways women are terrorized, have their mental and physical health destroyed, or in so many other ways are deprived of the rights and freedoms all of us deserve. It needs to be said that gender-based violence isn't always perpetrated against women, not always, but mostly. However, no sexual violence is acceptable. And the only answer is to stop it all and to stop it everywhere. The Women's Caucus Violence Against Women's team thanks you for being here today. Our goal isn't just to take in how bad things are, however. Our goal is to issue the challenge to help make things better. The person here today to focus us on that is Anne DePrince. Anne is a clinical psychologist, a distinguished university professor at the fine University of Denver, DU, and an expert in intimate violence who believes change is possible. She's the author of an incredible book called Every 90 Seconds, Our Common Cause Ending Violence Against Women, which was published by Oxford Press just last year. Anne has worked closely with victim service providers and policymakers over more than 2 decades to study the impact of multiple forms of violence against women on a range of outcomes, from health and economic well-being to education and safety. In fact, the US Department of Justice recognized her contributions to the nation's understanding of crime victims with the Vision 21 Crime Victims Research Award. Pretty cool. So she also serves as DU's first, I think this is really cool too, that there is such a thing. She serves as the DU's first Associate Vice Provost of Public Goods Strategy and Research. It's the best title ever. Thanks, Anne, for being with us today. We need to hear your words.
Oh, Marnie, thank you so much for that generous and powerful introduction and really setting the context of the problems that we face in the US and around the globe. And thank you to you, thank you to Anne for this opportunity to speak with you today. I am going to talk with you, as Marnie said, about some of the work that I've been doing thinking about violence against women, and in particular, really our common cause, ending violence against women. And it's been very exciting to think about the opportunity to talk with you across different corners of the globe, because while Every 90 Seconds in many ways is very situated in the US and some of the research that I share where my team works, this, of course, is indeed a global story. And the book's journey, in fact, began in some ways, really began abroad. It began in 19th century France, or at least it began when I started learning about the history of science and the history of my own field of psychology and our allied field of psychiatry, where so much of the formative history of those fields happened on the left bank of Paris. And it was when I was in college that I first learned about a hospital there called the Salpêtrière. And I was quite fascinated by that facility because it kept emerging at different points in history, in the history of science, playing an important role in, as I said, the founding of these fields. And it was a place over time that housed women, often in squalid conditions. These were typically difficult women, women who were marginalized by society because of poverty or because of what we would now understand as trauma and mental health systems. Though at the time, we didn't have that language or that understanding. In roughly the 19th century, the Salpêtrière starts playing a different role, where the Charcot, who was a medical professional at the time, wanted to make the Salpêtrière sort of a hub of scientific inquiry in Europe, and was quite successful in that regard in pulling professionals from across the continent to the Salpêtrière to learn about various medical issues. And at the time, Charcot and others around the continent were really captivated by what was called hysteria. and hysterical women. Now, hysteria is quite interesting. The Latin roots of the word stand for wandering uterus. So you can imagine that it was difficult to be diagnosed with hysteria as a man, as a male, as someone without a uterus. But really, I think speaks to the ways that we have thought about women from medical perspectives and pathologized them in part for their biology, as well as we'll talk about today, experiences that happen to them. Now, there's more I go into in the book with this fascinating history of what happens with the study and focus on hysteria in Paris in the late 19th century. But one piece of the story that I want to share with you today to frame our conversation is that one of the doctors that came to Paris to train, who got really quite interested in hysteria, which was sort of embodied by women as symptoms of fainting or fugue states, these kind of problems that today we would understand perhaps as post-traumatic stress disorder or dissociation. But at the time, medical professionals were trying to make sense of what was hysteria. And there was a moment where there was a great race, if you will, to try to explain what hysteria was in scientific terms, to understand it through the growing lens of medical science. Now, one of the doctors that came to the left bank of Paris to be part of conversations there and study and try to tackle this problem of hysteria was somebody you're probably very familiar with, Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud was living and working, though, in Austria, so he took some of those lessons and some of that inspiration to try to determine the cause of hysteria back to Austria, where he was spending hours and hours listening to mostly women patients and hearing their stories of the stories of their lives. And something quite radical happened for a moment, and that was that Freud, in listening to women, decided that the cause of hysteria was sexual abuse or sexual assault. And he published a paper called The Etiology of Hysteria. And this was a very bold claim, you can imagine, at the time, both in terms of his certainty of the cause of the problem, as well as the recognition that hysteria was not something about a wandering womb or the composition of a woman, but it was about what was done to women. Now, remember, we're in the 19th century, and Freud's patients were the daughters and wives of powerful people, powerful men in and around Austria. So you can probably imagine how well this theory went over ultimately. Freud wrote at the time about the professional isolation and scorn that he received in the aftermath of his claim that hysteria was caused by sexual assault. And in hindsight, that's probably not so surprising. That scorn caused Freud to recant. He took back that theory. He said, perhaps I was wrong, that women so convinced themselves that they had these abusive experiences that they fooled me too. And the problem is not sexual abuse or sexual assault. The problem is women's own thoughts, that they are having fantasies about sexual abuse and sexual assault. And that led to work that Freud is better known for, his Oedipal complex and Electra complex, things that you may see represented in art and in many forms of media into today. So I want to highlight something really important that happened and keep that as a frame for the rest of our conversation this morning. There was a moment in time in the 19th century where there was radical awareness, at least on Freud's part, that external things done to women caused hysteria, caused this problem. And when he recanted, when he shifted his view to talk about women's own instincts, what we see happen is that the cause of the problem becomes internalized to women. It's something about being a woman. And I mention that and I frame that because it drives a lot of my thinking about what do we do next? What happens at this moment in history with how we contend with the problem of violence against women and girls? Because Freud's legacy lives on in many ways, in a million subtle and not so subtle ways that we talk about violence against women as if it's a women's issue, as if it's a special interest issue, as if it's primarily a survivor's issue. It's a problem internalized to to women, women's post-traumatic stress disorder, women's reactions to violence, women's fear about being violated. And all these centuries later, these subtle ways that we have talked about and treated this as a women's issue have led in some ways to our expectation that women are responsible for avoiding victimization. We have sort of a cultural understanding that violence against women is so common that you hear beliefs out there that women are supposed to avoid being victimized, not marry that guy, not go on that run at night. And so there are a myriad ways from how our health systems are set up to how we talk about violence against women at a public and cultural level that carry this history of internalizing the problem to women. And I'm here to tell you, after some 20 years of doing research here in Colorado, and thinking a lot about the US context, that this is not a women's issue. This is not a special interest issue. This is not a survivors issue. We may need movements and actions that are women and survivors centered, but the issue is one that affects all of us. If you think about violence against women as sort of a tree, that's what we can see above ground. What I have become convinced of is that violence against women is each of our issue, regardless of our genders or life histories, because beneath the roots, beneath the surface of what we see are the roots. The roots of violence against women are tangled up with the great pressing public problems of our time. That if we want to solve a host of issues, whether it's gun violence or address migration policy in a more dignified and humane way, then we also share an interest in addressing the pressing problem of violence against women. So we could look at this through many lenses. We could think about healthcare, for example. Maybe that's a passion of some folks listening today. And violence against women, of course, has very obvious costs to survivors' health. We could think about that simply in terms of emergency room costs. We know in the US context that the emergency room is one of the most expensive places to receive care. And we have an entirely preventable situation. There is absolutely no need for us to be beating each other up and assaulting each other. If we could prevent that violence, then we have an obvious way to reduce costs to healthcare systems in the US and around the globe. But it's a more complicated story than that. It's not just about immediate preventable injuries. We know now from decades of research that there are hidden health costs too. Things such as respiratory problems, both for women and children who witness intimate partner violence. We know there are long-term health impacts of being victimized by someone on whom you depend, such as a romantic partner or a parent. So we know that the health system and the burdens that are borne by it in the US and elsewhere, that violence against women is a driving factor there. So we've got a new way in, a new way to talk to folks who care about healthcare administration and delivery and access and equity issues around the globe. We also, I think, have a new way to keep furthering our understanding as well as strategies for change. And I think here about work that my research has done on what to date has been a relatively less well-recognized problem, and that is the problem of brain injuries that happen in the context of intimate violence. On my research team for years, we were building these beautiful theories about the psychological impact of intimate victimizations, the ways that it may change how you think and understand yourself and the world around you, and that is true. And then we came to recognize that some of the impacts of trauma, of that kind of intimate violence, may be because of the kinds of physical violence that occurs. So we started working with partners in and around Denver to try to understand how common things like blows to the head were during victimization, or other kinds of injuries such as strangulation that can cut off the flow of oxygen to the brain and also cause injury to the brain. And in a larger study where we were working with the police department here in Denver, as well as the district attorney's office, we added a screening for head injuries. And we took a look at that data in the context of what we know about brain injuries more broadly in the US. And that larger context is that about 1 in 10 of us have been hit in the head or hit our heads so severely as to result in some kind of change in consciousness, maybe blacking out or having memory difficulties. And when we asked these same kinds of questions of women who had incidents of domestic violence reported to law enforcement, we found that 1 in 2 women, more than about 56%, reported a blow to the head or hitting their head in a way that resulted in an alteration in consciousness. That has led us to other work, and we've found in a more recent study that 8 out of 10 women seeking services for domestic violence here in Denver report at some point in their lifetimes having been hit in the head so hard as to result in a change in consciousness, something that would be suggestive of a mild brain injury. Now, the reason I mention that in part is because we know that brain injuries, as well as some of the psychological impacts of trauma, can go hand in hand with a host of problems. In that study with women who had incidents of domestic violence reported to law enforcement, we found that on average, women told us about 3 persistent problems that they were having. Things like trouble remembering, difficulty finding the right words, trouble concentrating, things that make it challenging to navigate something like a very complicated legal system, make it difficult to get through your daily life. And you might immediately think how difficult it would make it to accomplish some necessary things in life, such as getting access to basic needs, getting your bills paid on time, looking for and renting a house. So for those of you who maybe healthcare isn't your thing, maybe you're passionate about food and housing insecurity around the globe, it's another place where we could talk about food and housing insecurity as if it's in a way as if it isn't related to issues of intimate violence, and what a lost opportunity that would be. Because we've seen on our team things like the severity of violence that women suffer in an intimate relationship is linked with their attention and memory, with poorer attention performance, poorer attention, more difficulty using their attention systems. And in turn, in one study, we found that a year later, that predicted difficulty getting food on the table and a roof over their heads. So we are not talking about sort of academic splitting hair kinds of issues here. We are talking about problems that drive food and housing insecurity. And certainly in the US context, we know that violence against women is one of the major drivers of houselessness. You can imagine too that this constellation of trauma impacts can make it difficult, as I alluded to navigate legal systems. And maybe that's something you're passionate about. Perhaps you're connected with folks around the globe who are thinking about complicated issues of legal system reform. And if that's the case here too, this is an issue related to violence against women. Now, I'll note that I sometimes hear legal system reform issues come up as if they're in tension with criminal justice reform, that necessarily victims or survivors' interests may be in contrast or in tension with people who are convicted of crimes, and the problem of the many problems related to the criminal justice system in the US. And what I would point out here is that after many years of doing research with survivors about their experiences of the criminal justice system, this is a system that's flawed for most people. And so we do have, I think, a lot of common ground here for thinking about principles of justice and how we approach policing and other issues in our communities. Now, criminal justice reform, the criminal legal system, it takes up a lot of our public attention, and it should. We have a number of problems to solve there. But what I wanted to highlight for you today is the ways in which violence against women connects with other legal systems. In the US, things like the civil legal system, where in the aftermath of intimate violence, women may face a host of legal issues, from divorce to custody, things that are of central importance. We worked with a group here, or have been working for almost 10 years now, with a group here in Denver called the Rocky Mountain Victim Law Center. And years ago, in that early work, we set out to do a needs assessment to try to understand the legal needs that women were facing in the aftermath of intimate violence. And we sort of naively thought at the time, Denver's a community that really prides itself on having strong services for victims, a strong network of victim service providers. We thought we'd hear about an issue or two, maybe more lawyers were needed here or there. But when we asked broadly in the community about what was working and what wasn't working, we heard time and again the ways that women were falling between the cracks of the criminal and civil legal systems, the ways that their needs were not met, the ways that accurate information was inaccessible. We found about 50 barriers to getting legal service needs in the aftermath of intimate violence. And we heard from women the profound impact that had on other aspects of their lives. And I'll always remember one focus group where I was leading the focus group, and I was asking about legal needs and barriers to services. And one woman kept responding to my questions and talking about how she needed to get to a dentist. And I was monitoring the time, as one does in focus groups, to make sure everyone gets a chance to talk and that we covered all the questions. And so I sort of started to redirect her, in my mind, to what was back to legal issues. And she knew what I was up to, that I was trying to move from dentist back to legal issues. And she stopped me and she said, actually, my need for a dentist is a legal issue. How am I supposed to go in front of a judge and be taken seriously if I'm missing my teeth? And so I have learned from the work that I have done over time from survivors about how these issues are interconnected in ways that when we come at it through one lens, we have the potential to miss those interconnections. And of course, in the US, medical and dental insurance, your ability to access a dentist, it's tangled up with your ability to work. In many cases, the ways that our insurance systems are built into workplaces. And maybe it's economic issues that got you to log on at 10 p.m. tonight or 10 o'clock in the morning, whatever time you're joining us from. Maybe that's your passion. Well, again, we see these connections. In that same project with the police department that I mentioned, we found that women who were unemployed were more likely than other women with whom we talked to be re-victimized severely 6 months later. That economic insecurity is tangled up with both risk for violence as well as difficulty then being able to stay connected to and engaged in workplaces. We know in so many ways now that domestic violence, intimate partner violence, it is a workplace issue. Whether it's the fact that abusive partners follow their victims and survivors into the workplace, use workplace as something to sabotage, a way to coerce and control victims and survivors. The ways that abusive partners make workplaces more dangerous when they bring weapons and other violence into workplaces, or the fact that one can't realize your best potential when under the threat of violence, under the threat of coercion and control. So this is a business issue. We have to help people understand that violence against women is an economic issue, both in terms of prevention, that economic security is a means of prevention, and also that business owners have a stake, have an interest in helping workers thrive. And part of thriving, of course, depends on living free from violence and abuse. Now, you won't be I don't think you'll be surprised to imagine that there are obvious connections to education systems as well. And maybe that's your passion, that you're passionate about education access and inclusive educational opportunities around the globe. Again, we share an interest here that understanding how to help students thrive has a lot to do with helping them live lives free from violence. On my own research team, we did a study a few years back with school-age children. And what we discovered was that children who are either witnessing intimate partner abuse or victimized in the home, they performed significantly less well on attention and memory tasks than kids who had experienced traumas that weren't familial, things maybe like a car accident or a natural disaster. And the children who had those non-familial traumas, they looked more similar to kids without without any reported trauma history. But something was different for that group contending with the ongoing stress and strain of family violence. Now, it's hard to sit still and learn your 1, 2, 3s and ABCs if you're having attention problems. Attention is core to all that we do, the kind of social emotional learning that children need to do in classes, as well as the facts and figures that they need to learn. And so as we think about education opportunities and access, as we think about how to help teachers thrive, you cannot policy your way into more effective teachers if part of what they're having to manage in the classroom is unrecognized, unsupported trauma impacts. Now, we know that it's not just K-12, that was a school age example. We also know, as Marnie alluded to too in the opening, that this is an issue for our colleges and universities. Researchers have found that things such as sexual harassment, as well as sexual assault, drive attrition rates. These are ways that we lose talented women, as well as other minoritized and marginalized individuals, out of pathways to STEM careers at a time when we need STEM solutions to so many problems. And we know that the problem of campus sexual assault remains persistent. And in fact, I find this a useful example for us, for helping to paint a picture of just how persistent these problems have been. It turns out that despite years of awareness building around the problem broadly of intimate violence against girls and women, as well as years, decades now of attention to the specific problem of campus sexual assault, whether you think about that in terms of public awareness campaigns or years of Title IX related progress. The problem of campus sexual assault remains very high, very significant. 1 in 5 women report being sexually assaulted during their college years. And what I want you to know is that number was the same 50 years ago. 50 years ago, our earliest research on campus sexual assault traces back to about 50 years ago when the estimate was 1 in 5. So we haven't budged. Things haven't budged in terms of the number of women affected in some 50 years. That's true for many forms of violence. We have seen progress. We've seen percentage drops in some form of violence. We have certainly seen dramatic shifts in legal landscapes and so forth. And yet, every 90 seconds, a woman is victimized by a current or former intimate partner. And in that same minute and a half, another woman is sexually assaulted. That dire situation we know is then worse for women who are marginalized and minoritized by different aspects of their identities. And this is the problem. This is the context we find ourselves in at a moment in time where arguably we know more about violence against women and girls than we have at any other point in history. That we stand on the shoulders of women in the 60s and 70s in the women's movement who brought modern attention to this problem, who spoke out loud a problem that had otherwise been whispered across clotheslines. And those women of the 60s and 70s who began, who our modern movement is really rooted in their courage and their action, they changed so much about the world around us as it relates to these issues. And there was a promise, there was this hope that with consciousness raising, with awareness of the problem of intimate violence, that systems would change. And we have seen that hope that if we could help people understand the scope of this problem through to the modern Me Too movement, then change would be possible. And I think what I've come to understand through my work and my frame as a clinical psychologist is that awareness is important. After all, we can't fix a problem we don't know about. But awareness isn't enough, and it hasn't been enough for system change, for more profound change. And so what can we do instead? What do we turn to? Well, I think one of the things we can do is take a page from other social movements, from community organizers and social movement scholars who can show us a path forward, who show us what it takes to get to transformational change. And there are two things in particular that I take from our colleagues working on social movements and in organizing. And one is that we need to engage an ever-expanding network of people to understand that this is their issue, even if they don't connect to it initially through their own gender or their own life histories. This is their issue. It affects all of us. And we also need to offer them a compelling reason to take action. And it's in the very problems, the very situation that Marnie opened with today, and that I hope I've given you some examples of. I think it's in that very tangled and at times depressing and overwhelming situation that we actually have a path forward for hope, for solutions. Because we have a way to invite people in, to say the stories that are clogging their social media and news feeds each morning, the things that they care about are tangled up with violence against women. And that if we work together in new ways, if we are connected rather than disconnected by the interests and issues that we care about, new things are possible. It would be possible, for example, for you to reach out to a neighbor back home, maybe someone who's started their own small business, but hasn't ever thought about violence against women as an issue that involves them. You have a new way, I hope, to talk with them about how this is their interest, about how if they want their workers to succeed and thrive and stick with their businesses, they have to be thinking about violence against women in the design of their policies and their practices within their business. They have to be thinking about things that promote economic security, such as a livable wage, access to insurance, paid leave, so that somebody doesn't have to tell their supervisor why they need to take a day off in order to go to court to get a protection order. These are things that each of us can help agitate for people who might be willing to come at this problem and find solutions with us through, say, a business lens. But maybe it's school officials that you want to help make sense of their drive to not be the next school in the US affected by a mass shooting. They may not know that they have an interest in dating violence prevention, because one of the things that we know about mass shooters is that they commonly have a history of prior domestic violence or sharing misogynistic views, or that the mass shooting itself was in part to target girls and women, as Marnie also alluded to at the start today. So perhaps you're the person to help people see that if we can talk with young people early on about gender and equity and lead off and curtail the development of really rigid views of gender, misogynistic views, the kinds of things that underlie later intimate partner violence and risk for mass shootings. Healthy relationship education early in schools is a form of violence prevention, not just dating violence, but other forms of violence as well. And maybe it's that you have a family member, a brother or a sister who cares about healthcare, and they're in the medical profession, or coming full circle to where we started today, they care about the soaring healthcare costs of healthcare in America. And maybe they don't know that psychological intervention matters after intimate violence for heading off serious and long-term problems, that we have to get interventions to women and girls early to head off problems such as post-traumatic stress disorder and other physical health ailments. Maybe they don't know, and maybe you're the one to tell them that healthcare systems have an essential role to play in screening for and getting resources to people affected by intimate violence or at risk for intimate violence. Maybe they don't know, and you're the one to help them understand that they have a role to play in helping us think about healthcare systems and access are necessary for preventing unintended pregnancies at a time when reproductive healthcare is increasingly a privilege afforded to only few in the United States. So with that, before we open things up to larger conversation, I'd love if you might indulge me to read a little bit from the final chapter of the book that tries to pull together these various themes and research and data on violence against women and stories and connections to things in our news feeds to pivot us to action. And I'm hoping that's where we can spend the rest of our time today, leading into International Women's Day, to thinking about what is next. So from a chapter called From Hysteria to Justice, Transforming Awareness into Action. A century and a half ago, doctors averted their collective gaze from the intimate violence in women's lives to blame hysteria on women themselves. Meanwhile, violence against women continued to be wielded as a weapon of social control, tearing at the fabric of Indigenous and Black communities in the US. In the 1970s, the women's movement ushered in an age of awareness that promised change. Awareness building led us down interconnected paths of criminalization and medicalization. Along those paths, gun laws have saved lives, but focusing on criminal legal responses hasn't deterred violence against women overall. Effective treatments for PTSD relieve suffering, even as the roots of violence against women persist. One step forward, two steps back. This has been our dance for decades. Today, stopping violence against women falls to few. The criminal legal system is charged with enforcing laws. A school delivers prevention programming to the children in attendance that day. A doctor privately addresses a survivor's pain. And still, every 90 seconds, a woman is sexually assaulted. Another is abused by an intimate partner. We're not fated to this pattern, though. A world without intimate violence is possible, as much as that sounds like science fiction. After all, social change is science fiction, according to organizer Adrienne Maree Brown. To end violence against women would be to imagine into existence a world that none of us has known, and to persuade people that the actions they believe impossible are actually the only and the best way forward. To realize that transformation, we're going to need a vision that's more compelling than the status quo. And our compelling vision starts with finding an irresistible reason for change. In recent history, we've had no shortage of reasons proffered to end violence against women, protect women, law and order. Reasons like these get bandied about when intimate violence makes the headlines. Inevitably, some politician, usually a man, stands up to tell us that they care about ending violence against women because they have a daughter, a sister, mother, and/or wife. If stopping violence against women simply required having a daughter, sister, mother, and/or wife, though, we'd have ended it already. Since we haven't, let's assume knowing or being related to a woman isn't a compelling reason for change. Personally, I'd prefer we end violence against women and address its many impacts because it's the right thing to do. Because girls and women, like all human beings, deserve to live lives free of violence and abuse, because there's no dignity in being abused, abusing others, or being the person who does nothing despite the knowledge that a woman is harmed every 90 seconds in our communities. However, we're not going to stop violence against women because it's the right thing to do, because we know the facts, or because we're altruistic. We know this from 19th century France and the many Me Too movements that have passed us by. We know this from watching interrelated movements to end racism and other forms of oppression, where facts and altruism don't change systems. What then is our compelling reason to move from awareness to action? Our reason is right there. It's in the interconnections between the issues we each care about. That violence against women is inextricably linked to the issues that stoke our greatest passions and affect our communities. So with that, thank you so much for your time, whether it's morning or late night where you are in talking today. I want to acknowledge so many people who are part of the work that I have the great privilege to do. And I hope we may now open things up for questions and discussion. Oh,
Okay. Marnie, would you like to throw out the first question?
Would I like to unmute?
It's been really incredible. And I'm taking
Yeah.
notes, Anne. I've been taking copious notes. There's a lot, lots that I need to know.
Yeah, sorry about that. I always forget to unmute. So I have a question for you, and it's not really a question, but a request. And it is about a parable in the introduction to your book that you talk about basically a village that's experiencing some mysterious and terrible occurrences. And I would love for you to share that, briefly share that story, but also tell us why you told it.
Yes, thank you, Marnie. So lots of community organizers share this parable of the river. Desmond Tutu also was known for sharing the parable, so you may have heard it in some version or another. As I learned from a community organizer, the idea is you're living in a village by a river, and you hear some noise, and you see babies coming down the river in baskets, and you're curious, why are babies coming down the river in baskets? And you organize some people to come help pull the babies out of the river, and people get all excited to help the babies, and they pull the babies out. But then pretty soon the babies keep coming. There's more and more babies, and they need money, and they're crying, and they're loud, and they need food. And so people try to rally and build an organization to get them food or to rock them to sleep. But eventually people in the community, they get frustrated. Why is all this money going to these babies? And what about our babies? And why do we have to take care of these babies? We don't even know where they're coming from. And then you see tensions emerging in the community, and suddenly somebody wants to make babies in the river illegal. Let's stop the problem by making it illegal. You can't be a baby in the river anymore. And the point of the parable is that we can keep going and going and going and through machinations to try to address the babies, argue about whether the babies should be there. But when is the point when we go upriver to figure out why babies are getting put in the river in the first place? And I think from an organizing perspective, what are the root causes? How do we go upriver, whether it's for primary prevention to say, how do we stop violence against women and its interrelated problems to begin with? But how do we understand the systems? How do we understand the ways that this problem has become persistent? And I see so many parallels in my world where we fight over whose fault it is, or we end up with laws and systems that are in tension with one another. And so, yes, thanks for raising that, Marnie.
I loved that story.
Okay.
And I think,
yeah, I had a question, but I just want to mention very quickly first one thing. When you were talking about academic women, STEM women who are assaulted and can't finish their work in college and all of that, just wanted to mention that our feminist book club, Books Abroad, is reading a book right now that deals with that. It's called Lessons in Chemistry. And I'm reading it right now, and many of the things that you mentioned are dealt with in that book. That, you know, this brilliant woman is trying to succeed despite exactly the kinds of things you mentioned. So for anyone who isn't already reading the book and signed up for that event, I would suggest that is a very good segue from what we're talking about now. Anyway, on to my question. Well, as we've talked about, we know that gender-based violence disproportionately impacts certain populations: Black, Indigenous, and increasingly Asian women, people with disabilities, trans individuals, and women in poverty are disproportionately more likely to be victims to this spectrum of violence. Do you see any trends that would indicate that this is improving or otherwise changing?
I'm collecting my thoughts because it's such an important question, Anne, and I'm of two minds. I love data. I'm a researcher, right? That's my bread and butter, is how can we use data to understand situations we're in and find paths forward. I think year to year there are things, there are research projects, say in the US, that take a dive to look at what are the rates of intimate violence, different kinds of violence, and proportions in different communities. And I think as you track those data over time, you can see some encouraging trends that overall rates of domestic violence, for example, drop over the decades. I think, though, the downside of that lens and wondering whether things are moving a percentage point here or there is that the ways that I sometimes see that data get used, it assumes that there's some tolerable, which is not what you're asking, Anne, but assumes there's some tolerable level of violence. Like if we can drop it 10 points,
there you go.
pat ourselves on the back, that's great. And so I think we have to pair those questions about trends, which are so important, because that's how we can put a spotlight on who is most impacted by the issue and make sure that those communities are centered in driving solutions and so forth, without falling into, I think, sometimes the policy risk of it being implicit that some level of violence is to be expected. I often hear people talk about violence against women as a once and future problem. And if we decide that it's a future problem, that's going to change our behaviors. That's going to change what we imagine is possible. And so I would love for us and I don't say this naively, I literally have studied these issues for decades. I would love for us to find frames where we believe in a future where this kind of violence doesn't occur, because I think we'll be more radical. I think we'll look for different kinds of collaborations if we're trying to get to zero, rather than sometimes the way I see those data get used. That wasn't quite what you were asking, Anne, but it triggered some of those things that I grapple with.
Yeah, that's really important, really
That's
fascinating.
great.
Marnie, do you want to go ahead, or shall I read it?
Yeah, no, I've got one. It's
Okay.
last July, the White House issued a report on the US government's women, peace and security agenda. So I'm wondering if you saw anything significant, new, particularly creative, and if you part two, if you had an opportunity, what would be the first thing, or what would be the most important thing that you would want to say to President Biden?
Oh,
We're a political organization, after all.
I think that report, I was struck by a couple of things. On one hand, I was just so heartened by the way that intimate violence was connected, and gender inequity were connected to so many issues. And I think that level of complex thinking is exactly what we need. Again, this isn't a women's issue. We should be centering women in how we think about and lead responses, but it is not a women's issue. It is connected to so much about the health and well-being of our communities broadly. And I saw that kind of complexity in that report, which was really encouraging. I think a lot of when the report was speaking about what progress have we made, what investments are we making, I think there's really a lot to be proud of in this country related to things like the Violence Against Women Act and VAWA, or what people refer to as VAWA. It's interesting when you look at VAWA, a lot of VAWA is really tied to criminal legal responses to gender-based violence. And that's been an important piece of change over the last many decades, that when you look back to the 70s and 80s, police didn't take these things seriously, and police weren't working in what we now would call trauma-informed ways. And those changes are so important. And that's too late. It's too late by the time a woman has no other choice but to pick up the phone and call the police, or a neighbor hears something and calls the police. It's too late. We have missed so many opportunities for prevention by the time we get there. And so I think what I would be really interested in, if I ever got to have coffee with Joe, would be to talk about how do we continue to improve system responses, existing systems, and think critically and reflectively about how they work and don't work, and what our goal is. What is our goal? Is it to get to zero violence? Is it to contain violent offenders? Is it how are we using these systems? But how do we back it up? Because in so many communities, a call to the police really is a social service call. It's related to poverty. It's related to not having access to food or medications. And we've got to back up the truck and deal with those issues.
I'm going to throw in, sorry, Anne, I'm just going to throw in one little comment here. And that is that one of our issues is that VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, does not protect the American women doesn't provide support to American women when they are abroad, like the 9 million or anybody for that matter. But the violence, it doesn't apply to women when they're living abroad, or when they're traveling abroad, or when they're in school or whatever. It's a huge issue for us. And in 2019, I always want to say 19, but anyway, in 2019, the government ceased funding the only organization that was available to support those women. And that is one of our major objectives in the near future, is to try and help get that funding back. So I have to say that because you reminded me of that issue, and I want to make sure everyone knows that and people come and help.
So important, Marnie. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a question from Karen in Greece. To what extent does familial violence correlate with economic trends, unemployment, income insecurity, etc.? Certainly a spike was noticed during COVID lockdowns, work from home, but on a broader scale, can you point to any longitudinal studies that have been done?
Great question, Karen. Thank you so much for that. Yes, there are some really important, there's an important body of research on exactly these issues. Some researchers used the 2008 economic downturn during that period to look at longer term economic impacts on rates of coercive control in relationships and violence against women. Researchers have been very creative. Some have looked at things like hospitalizations rates and what's happening in local economies. And the long and the short of it is that economic insecurity is linked with increases in coercive control and violence against women. And you can see that looking at macroeconomic trends. You also can see that in terms of a colleague in the Northeast who has looked at rates of foreclosures on houses and then community level instances of domestic violence. So you do see these links between economic insecurity and violence. So it is very much an economic issue, that economic security policies that provide economic security to families, they are violence prevention. I think the caution I would make there, those are the data, that relationship is there. I think it's lots of people experience economic stress and do not coercively control and abuse their partners. And so I think it's important that we understand these relationships and think about how economic policy is a tool to use in violence prevention, at the same time that we do not dismiss this as, there's so many ways that we dismiss violence against women and perpetration as we sort of write off excuses for it. There are many people who were locked down during COVID who did not abuse their partners. And so we have to keep digging to get to deeper levels of things, and economic stress is a factor.
That's very, that's very.
So we have to keep looking. Yeah, it's trying to figure out what's going on upriver.
Oh, there's
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So there's another question from Connie Board that I want to expand on about the ERA, basically. And I know recently I was thinking about it because there was a decision made that came off of the last year's decision about oh God, what's the word? When you have when men who are violently assaulting women are given a restraining order. There it is, restraining order, and they were now they've said it's okay for them to have a gun. Previously, that wasn't okay, but because of the decision made by the Supreme Court, now they can. If there are ways to connect that, I think, to the Equal Rights Amendment, and I wonder if you have an example of the ways that it really is directly associated to the decision.
Yeah, certainly the issue of gun violence. There's so many important themes in that question. Thank you to I missed the person's name who asked it, but thank you, Marnie, for passing that question along. I think that, you know, we need both and. So if we presume that certain people in our society, either by law or cultural and legal tradition, don't have the same rights as other people, then it is not surprising downstream when problems such as victimization of those communities happen and are tolerated. So I think my hat is off. I have learned so much across my career from my colleagues working on law and in policy around around how to agitate, in the good community organizing sense of the term, for legal change. I think the gun issue, as it connects to all of this, is really a fascinating one. And you have an example too, where there is a disconnect between laws as they're intended and what happens in practice. So, for example, in many states with laws around folks who are convicted of domestic violence offenses not being allowed to have weapons, there aren't necessarily policies and procedures in place to get weapons back from people. And there's not necessarily money for investigators to go check that there aren't guns in homes. And so you have on the face of it an apparently positive thing in terms of law, and the enactment of it is disconnected. And so you do, and these tend to be the stories that make it into the media, where somebody shouldn't have had access to a weapon and they used it to kill their partner and their family and whoever else. So that you're raising such an important set of issues, and that the gun violence issue it's like layers of an onion. As you keep peeling back the onion there, you have these particular laws, and there may be laws on the books that we know for states that have those laws, intimate partner homicides, killing of women does go down. So there is an impact. We know there's a implementation problem. And then there's a larger issue where there's also some gun violence research indicating that it's about access to guns, whether those are legally or illegally available in communities. With more guns comes more killing of women. So it's, Marty, I think there are so many important things to be fighting for, such as the ERA, equal rights, and on the paper, I don't want to diminish that to a paper level change, but we have examples of other legal policies where we also need the political appetite and the community will to make sure that our dollars go into enforcing and enforcement and prevention of rights that we are supposed to have.
I have a related question, a more overarching question about the ERA from Connie in Paris on the legal issue. Women are denied strict scrutiny in the courtroom. Wouldn't passing the ERA solve this and many other issues? Under strict scrutiny, the government has a difficult burden to meet, while under rational basis, most laws will be upheld. The Supreme Court has refused to make sex a specific classification, but it did not impose the rational basis test on matters involving sex discrimination. So it's different from other things. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that I'm grateful for lawyers because I'm a psychologist. So I recognize most of the words you said, but that is out of my wheelhouse in terms of a particular comment on that. And I think that you're really getting us to action, right? In asking that question, because there's only so far I can get as a psychologist with the knowledge and frames that I bring. What I can bring to the table is helping understand consequences and what we know about behavior change and prevention, and that's an important piece of building arguments. And then what somebody with other teaching experience, parenting experience, so that this is exactly the kind of cross-cutting interdisciplinary conversation we need. Because I'm not going to find solutions as a psychologist working in isolation. My lawyer colleagues, they're not going to find solutions in isolation because the practice of law then involves all the messiness of human beings. And so I love that question and the fact that I can't answer it because it really speaks to the need for collaboration across traditional groups that haven't always talked to each other around these issues. We've tended to be, even within the violence against women field, we tend to be kind of siloed of people who focus on domestic violence, say, versus sexual assault. And there are some different dynamics to those kinds of trauma, and there's more that's similar, but we're not always in the same rooms grappling with things together.
I've learned that with all of these action teams that the Global Women's Caucus has, that there are so many overlapping issues. Sometimes I wonder whether it was smart to separate these issues out to different teams because they do overlap, and our leaders are often doing research and events together. There's so many questions. My mind is overflowing with things I wanted to ask. I wonder if I could go back real quick to the economic thing. And you've been speaking about domestic violence, but there's also, I mean, really violence and black eyes and real assault. But there's also, as a psychologist, you know, there's this emotional violence and emotional fear and all of that. I wondered, in terms of economics, what you think about, now we're going into an economics field, and neither of us are economists either, but this principle of universal basic income, or some kind of a real secure basis, economic basis. I understand that in some model cases, as soon as they get economic security, this basic income, the divorce rate goes up, because women feel that confidence. Do you see something like universal basic income as being a partial solution to this problem?
Yeah, so the way that I come at that is thinking about in victim perpetrator relationships, for lack of better words, that one of the important things for understanding both the consequences as well as ability for somebody to leave an abusive relationship is understanding the degree of dependence and interdependence in that relationship. And on our research team, when we have looked at things like being more dependent, which can include being economically dependent or interdependent, feeling responsible for an abusive partner who maybe you're the breadwinner for the family. And so that if you kick me out, I'm going to be on the streets. This is, you know, abusive tactics that try to coerce and control women by saying like all this harm's going to come to me if in any event. You can imagine these can be a interdependent abusive dynamics. That is really important for understanding the degree of harm as well as the degree of difficulty leaving a relationship. We've found some of these things, such as having more children in common, things like economic dependence. You could imagine having more children as maybe a source of wonder and wonderfulness in life, and it costs a lot of money. And so it can increase economic dependence in a relationship, that those kinds of things are linked with being less likely to leave an abusive relationship. Mm-hmm. So, and I absolutely agree that we have to be talking about economic issues and economic policy hand in hand with these issues. I would also say that while you're right, I did focus more on physical and sexual violence in comments today, but economic abuse is a part and a component of intimate partner abuse, whether that's controlling access to money, literally stealing money from a partner, controlling access to work, sabotaging work, that these are all things that we would put under a frame of economic abuse. And that is very much a dynamic for many women of intimate partner abuse. I was just giving a talk recently, and somebody said, why did you call your book Every 90 Seconds? Because it makes it sound like violence is a discrete instance, where we know in ongoing relationships, it's patterns of behavior over time, or can be. I was like, that's a great point, but the title's already done. And just trying to point out that there's a problem and there are solutions in the title, but you raised such an important point, Anne, because it isn't necessarily about a discrete instance of violence. And certainly for some women, intimate partner, lots of researcher types like myself talk about intimate partner abuse, because there may not be instances of physical violence. There may be chronic threat of violence, which is used to coerce and control women's behaviors. There may be economic abuse, reproductive coercion and control. So you have unveiled a host of really important issues in the question that you asked. Thank you.
Yeah. A whole generation of people learned that term, to the moon, Alice. You know, that term that people a little bit older than you. Like, and he never touched her in this very popular television series, never touched her. But everybody knows To the Moon. Money?
So one other thing people do is that they use their children and threaten their children, and that's another lovely form of abuse. You made me think of. So there are a lot of things that we can do, little and large, and collaboration is great, but often with so many things, we have trouble making the leap from our good intentions to action. Sometimes like we don't speak up when we hear somebody being cruel, or somebody perpetuating a myth that we know isn't true. Sometimes we don't put our hand out to help when we know someone is being abused, for example. What are your thoughts on how to get us from good intentions to action? What can we say to ourselves?
Yeah.
What can we do?
Yeah, I love that question, Marnie. And I love too, because for me, it really distills also that we, in my experience, I think we sometimes think about change in we have a stereotype of what change means, that to be part of a movement against intimate violence means I have to be willing to march on Washington and have a bullhorn and be at the head of the line, that's what that might be some people's view of social change. For other people, it might be what you were saying, Marnie, that it's about hearing something and checking on a neighbor. And for some people, that might feel really, I don't want to go knock on my neighbor's door. I'm too shy. That's not my thing. And so I've been really affected by some reading from community organizers, particularly one organizer, Daniel Hunter, who talks about the need in social movements for different kinds of people. That we have to help people understand there is a room for you and your passions and your temperament and how you like to go about change, that we need all of that. And he has some clever ways of talking about, organizers versus helpers, and labels that people may see themselves in or not, and that really isn't the point of the exercise. But in some of his writing, he gives permission for you to think about the way that you want to show up and do something. The important is the doing of something. That so often we can read books and come to incredible opportunities like the programming you provide here, and that can feel like the doing. It's not the doing, it's the getting ready to do. So what I would really encourage, Marnie, is that you do some self-reflection. What is your self-interest in this issue? How do you connect to it? What feeds your soul? What's going to keep you being able to come back and do work over time? It may be that your soul is fed by those big actions, that you are the person to organize the Day of Purple in Spain a few years ago, or New Toots, I don't know how to in France in 2019. You may be the person to do that kind of activity. You may be the person who we need knocking on a neighbor's door because you haven't seen them in a few days and you want to make sure they're okay. You may be the person who your skill set is about navigating systems, and we need you in the halls of Congress, figuring out power and who's got it and how to agitate for change. So Marnie, I think it's about understanding your interest in this issue, what it connects to, how to talk to people about your interest, how to explain to somebody who's like, I'm not a woman, I was never victimized, this doesn't matter to me. Having things on the tip of your fingertips to be able to explain to them and help pull out their self-interest, so that you're constantly recruiting folks for this important work.
Okay.
So one other question is that we know that the numbers are underreported. I mean, and for all sorts of different reasons, a lot of people just don't want to, they think it's their fault. They buy the myths, or they're too afraid. They're afraid they're going to lose their job, et cetera. So is there a route to improving those numbers, do you think, or and tracking them, even the ones that are there, what can be done to get some accurate read and to get people to look at it?
Yeah. I think researchers have made a lot of progress in how we ask about violence. So back in the day, decades ago, we might have asked people if they were raped or abused. And we now understand that those terms are really value laden, and people may not see their experiences in those terms. And so if you're using that language, they'll tell you no. But if you use a behaviorally defined term, like has your partner ever done XYZ to you, people will say, yes, that happened to me. So we have gotten a lot more accurate, I think, in rates. It depends on what kind of reporting you're talking about too. Reporting to law enforcement, we know, is dramatically underestimates the problem, whereas some other research methods, I think, have gotten a lot stronger. So how we talk about the issue matters. And then there are some really interesting pieces around public discourse and rates of violence. So for example, there was some longitudinal work happening with young people looking at rates of dating violence before and after 2017, when Me Too really came into public consciousness. And young people's rates of saying, when you asked in this behaviorally defined way, have these experiences happen to you, those rates didn't change. But young people's likelihood of labeling it as abuse went up. And so it's interesting to think about our cultural familiarity with terms and willingness to use different terms. And so for those of you advocating around these issues, I think having different language in your back pocket for different audiences can be really impactful. And that it does matter. Our public discourse matters. More people understood their experiences as being abuse after Me Too really burst into consciousness, and that gives another way to help people think about and access resources and so forth. So
that's really interesting. I have one more question about the statistics, since you're talking a little bit about the statistics. Well, two things, and to pull it out to a global audience again.
Sure.
Democrats abroad are in 180 different countries. So I have a twofold question. The 90 seconds, is that a US number or a global number? And the second thing is, on this whole earth of 180 countries, is there any place where violence against women is relatively low? Where should we all move to? Or who should we copy? Who should we emulate?
Well, we need you all in the communities you're in doing this work, because it is possible to change. So stay where you are and keep having impact. The rates globally, thanks for asking about that, Anne. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 3 women have experienced intimate violence. So you see this picture around the globe. It's not radically different. Certainly, as Marnie talked about, there are violence, I think, gets enacted and perpetrated in different ways or under different excuses. Marnie mentioned honor killings, though, of course, the problem of femicide is a problem anywhere around the globe. I think there's some really interesting work you might be interested in by Professor Sarah Deer. She's a lawyer and colleague at the University of Kansas. She's got a great book that came out, gosh, probably 8 or so years ago now, called The Beginning and End of Rape. And she traces the history of colonization in the US and shifts in indigenous communities where it is believed before colonization that violence against women didn't happen. It didn't, and it wouldn't have happened. And when it did happen, it would have been handled very differently with what we would now understand to be more transformative or restorative justice rather than our current penal system. So it's a really interesting book for thinking about how some of the legacy of colonization and the legacy of white supremacy interact with how violence shows up in countries around the globe through the lens of the story here in the US. So you might be really interested in that book. It's a terrific and important read.
Really sounds like something for us. Marnie, did you have another question, or are we ready? You're on mute. Marnie?
I'm not going to say this is age related, but it's getting worse. I think we're just going to say really, really, really thank you. And because I think we're running out of time. And I know, Anne, you have a few things that you'd like to say before we all go away.
I do. So I want to make sure, one thing that Anne has said over and over again is that each of us has our own way of contributing to helping. So I do have a comment about that. But first of all, I want to thank you both, Anne and Marnie, for sharing all of this incredible information, which has been recorded and will be posted on our websites and everywhere we can find. And I would like to thank all of you who have joined us today on this call and remind you that GWC does have a continuing program of events and actions for you in celebration of Women's History Month, including a special ERA Cake Time call to action and discussion of that book I mentioned earlier, Lessons in Chemistry, which very closely is related to today's topic and is sponsored by our feminist reading group, Books Abroad. So follow the link that we're going to put in the chat box, the GWC events page, and take a look at something that might interest you. And this is the point, finally. If this presentation has inspired you to action, there's really a lot that you can do to help, small, medium, and large efforts. I invite you to consider stepping up as a Women's Caucus volunteer, whether locally within your own DA chapter in one of these 180 countries, or not that many, or as part of the Global Women's Caucus Network. I'm sure Marnie and our other team leaders would appreciate more helping hands to do the important work that Anne has outlined for us. Whether you have a few, just several hours a week or just a few, we could really use your help. And if you're not exactly sure how you can best plug into the group, I encourage you to take our volunteer survey on the website and seek out our wonderful volunteer coordinator, Christina Skovsgaard in Oslo, for a chat. She'll help you explore ways that you can best contribute your time and talent. She's just wonderful. So get involved in whatever way works for you and don't put it on the back burner. You'll find the links in the chat box to help get you going. All right, so again, I would like to thank everybody for being on the call. And thank you so much, Marnie. Thank you for putting this all together. And if there's no other comments, then we'll be ready to end the call. Marnie, did you have another comment?
Well, thank you, Anne. And I think this was, if people aren't inspired, I just don't know what it would take.
Okay, so
thank you.
Thanks again
Thank you.
for everybody. Thanks for coming, and go volunteer. We need you. All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Okay.